The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavy in the air, a comforting blanket over the clatter of plates and the murmur of morning conversations. It was just another Tuesday at Ruby's Diner, a place nestled on the corner of Elm and Maple, known for its killer pancakes and the friendly, if a little harried, waitstaff. Sunlight filtered through the slightly grimy windows, painted stripes across the worn linoleum floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the beams. Sarah tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, trying to look composed. Her heart, however, was doing a frantic jig in her chest. She had ordered the special eggs, bacon, and a side of grits, a small treat she usually couldn't afford. But today, she'd felt a whisper of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, things would turn around. Her job at the laundromat barely covered rent, and the car trouble last week had wiped out her meager savings. She was counting every penny, every single one. Across the booth from her, an imaginary friend seemed to nod understandingly. She often talked to herself, or rather to an invisible confidant. When the world felt too heavy, the diner was filling up the breakfast rush in full swing. Families with boisterous children, construction workers on their break, and a scattering of older folks, enjoying their morning paper, all added to the lively hum. Shirley, the head waitress, a woman with a beehive hairdo and a heart of gold, zipped between tables, her order pad a blur. She knew Sarah well, knew her struggles. Sometimes, Shirley would slip her an extra biscuit or a free refill, a small kindness that meant the world then he walked in. At first, nobody seemed to notice. He was wearing dark sunglasses, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a simple denim jacket. He walked with a casual swagger, but not an arrogant one, more like someone comfortable in his own skin, even if that skin was famous. He chose a booth in the corner, away from the main traffic, and pulled out a newspaper. Shirley, ever observant, paused, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. She'd served enough celebrities in her time to recognize the signs of a man trying and failing to be inconspicuous. He ordered a stack of pancakes, a side of crispy bacon, and a tall glass of milk. His voice when he spoke was a low rumble, instantly recognizable if you were paying attention, but most weren't. They were too busy with their own lives, their own morning routines. Sarah, lost in her internal budget crisis, barely registered his presence. She was tracing patterns on the condensation of her water glass, trying to mentally add up her bills. Plate arrived steaming and golden, a temporary balm to her frayed nerves. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing it might be her last proper meal for a while. The taste of the salty bacon and fluffy eggs was a fleeting comfort. But as she ate, the quiet dread began to creep back. The cost of everything seemed to be rising while her income stubbornly stayed the same. It was a race she was losing. She finished her meal, pushing the plate away with a sigh. Shirley, ever efficient, appeared with a check, placing it face down on the table. "Everything all right, honey?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Noticed her, managed a weak smile. "Just fine, Shirley. The food was delicious as always." She reached for the check, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it, the moment of truth. She flipped it over, her breath hitched. The number stared back at her, a stark impover. It wasn't just her breakfast. There was an additional charge, a mix-up from a previous visit she'd thought was settled, piled on top of the already tight budget for this meal. It was more than she had in her wallet, more than she could scrape together until her next paycheck. A wave of nausea washed over her, making the diner's warm air suddenly feel stifling. Her vision blurred, the comforting hum of conversation fading into a distant roar. A single tear, hot and defiant, tracked a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, hoping no one had noticed, but someone had. From the corner booth behind the dark sunglasses, a pair of intensely blue eyes had just lifted from a newspaper, and they were watching. The number on the bill seemed to mock Sarah, growing larger and more intimidating with each passing second. It wasn't just the amount, it was the symbol of everything that was going wrong. The unexpected car repair, the late rent notice, the medical bill from her last bad cold that still hadn't been paid. It was all piling up, a relentless, suffocating weight. This small, seemingly insignificant bill at Ruby's diner was the final straw, the one that broke her already fragile composure. She felt the flush creep up her neck, hot and embarrassing. Her palms were clammy and her stomach clenched into a tight knot. How could she have been so foolish to think even for a moment that she could afford this small luxury? She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, wishing she could disappear, wishing the floor would simply swallow her whole. "Sarah, honey, are you sure you're all right?" Shirley's voice was softer now, tinged with genuine worry. She'd seen that look before too many times on the faces of people trying to hold it all together. Sarah opened her eyes, trying to force a smile, but her lips felt stiff and unresponsive. It's just a bit more than I expected," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She gestured vaguely at the bill, as if it were a venomous snake, poised to strike. I think there's a mistake." Shirley took the bill, her brow furrowing as she scanned the itemized list. Looks like a charge from last week, sweetie. Remember that extra coffee and pie you had when you were waiting for your sister? It looks like it didn't get cleared off." Shirley's voice was gentle, but the explanation only solidified Sarah's despair. She did remember. She'd been so sure she'd paid for it then. Another mistake? Another oversight? Another hole in her already threadbare finances? A choked sob escaped Sarah's throat before she could stop it. Her shoulders began to tremble uncontrollably. The tears which she had been fighting so hard to hold back now flowed freely, hot and unstoppable, tracing past through the faint smudges of dust on her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, utterly defeated. The clatter and hum of the diner seemed to amplify her distress, making her feel even more exposed from a secluded booth. Elvis had been watching. He'd noticed her when she first walked in, a quiet, unassuming young woman with a weary look in her eyes. He'd seen her pick up the check, seen the sudden stiffening of her posture, the way her hand had flown to her mouth. He recognized the signs of quiet desperation. He'd lived it himself, once upon a time, before the records, before the fame, before the world knew his name. He remembered the gnawing anxiety of not knowing where the next meal would come, from the shame of not having enough. His gaze flickered around the diner. A few other patrons had started to notice. Heads turned discreetly, whispers rippled through the air. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the public display of emotion. Others stared, curiosity mingling with mild sympathy. No one moved to help. It was a common human reaction, to witness distress and feel a pang of empathy, but to be paralyzed by uncertainty, unsure of how to intervene without making things worse. Elvis's jaw tightened. He hated to see anyone in pain, especially when it was financial hardship. It felt so unfair. He had more money than he could ever spend, and here was a young woman reduced to tears over what was probably just a few dollars. It didn't sit right with him. He took another sip of his milk, his mind racing. How could he help without drawing a massive crowd, without turning this woman's private moment into a circus? That was always the challenge. His fame, a blessing in so many ways, could also be a gilded cage, making simple human interaction complex. He glanced at Shirley, who was now kneeling beside Sarah's booth, her hand gently rubbing the woman's back. Shirley was murmuring comforting words, but her own face was etched with helplessness. She understood. She knew the struggles of her regulars. She knew that sometimes a few dollars could mean the difference. Between making it and breaking down, tears continued to flow down Sarah's face, silent and heavy. She tried to muffle the sounds, but a soft, ragged gasp escaped her. It was the sound of a spirit truly breaking, of a person pushed past their limit. And that sound, more than anything, solidified Elvis's resolve. He couldn't just sit there. Not anymore. He pushed his half-eaten pancakes away, his appetite suddenly gone. His blue eyes, no longer hidden by the sunglasses, were fixed on Sarah, a deep well of compassion shining within them. He knew what he had to do. Elvis leaned back against the red pine of the booth, his gaze unwavering on the scene unfolding across the diner. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, a mix of empathy, frustration, and a deep-seated desire to act. He remembered the early days in Tupelo, Mississippi, when his family had next to nothing. He remembered his mama, Gladys, sometimes having to make do with whatever meager food they could afford, always making sure he and his daddy had enough, even if it meant she went without. He remembered the humiliation of being poor, the quiet shame that clung to you like cheap cologne. He saw that same shame, that same raw vulnerability on Sarah's face. Now, her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her hands still clutching the dreaded bill, as if it were a death warrant. Shirley, bless her heart, was doing her best to console her. But words alone couldn't fix a financial problem. Elvis knew that. He knew money couldn't buy happiness, but it sure could alleviate a lot of misery. "Lord," he murmured under his breath, barely audible. "Help her." He considered his options. He could discreetly slip some cash to Shirley and ask her to cover the bill without revealing his identity. That was his usual method for quiet acts of charity, but something about this felt different. The sheer public nature of Sarah's distress, the way she was so completely broken, felt like it needed a more direct, more personal touch. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about human dignity, about letting someone know they weren't alone. But then there was the problem of him, Elvis Presley, the king. If he stood up, if he approached her, the whole diner would erupt. The whispers had already begun to pick up a low hum of recognition, starting to spread. A few discreet camera flashes, a quick murmur of, "Is that?" He didn't want to make a spectacle of her pain, didn't want to turn her private moment into a fan frenzy. His fame was a double-edged sword. He wanted to help, but he also didn't want to overwhelm her or draw more attention to her distress. He pulled off his sunglasses, letting his famous blue eyes scan the room. He saw the various reactions, some faces full of pity, some openly curious, a few even annoyed by the disruption to their breakfast. But no one was stepping forward. That was the most disheartening part. People were witnessing another human being in profound despair, and they were doing nothing. His gaze returned to Sarah. Her hands had dropped from her face, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen. Her gaze was fixed on the table, as if she were praying for it to open up and swallow her whole. The bill lay beside her, a cruel taunt. Shirley stood up, a look of deep frustration on her face. "I'll go talk to the manager, Sarah," she said, her voice laced with empathy. "Maybe we can work something out." But even as she said it, her eyes flickered with doubt. Rules were rules, and Ruby's was a business. Elvis knew that going to the manager would likely mean a protracted discussion, more embarrassment for Sarah, and possibly still no resolution. He didn't want that. He wanted this woman's suffering to end, and he wanted it to end now. He took a deep breath, the decision solidifying in his mind. Forget the fame for a moment. Forget the cameras, the whispers, the potential chaos. This was about one human being reaching out to another. This was about compassion. This was about remembering where he came from. He suddenly caught Shirley's eye. When she looked his way, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, quickly replaced by a knowing, almost understanding nod. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, indicating she shouldn't go to the manager. Then he gave her a tiny nod in Sarah's direction. A silent command, a plea. Shirley, who had years of experience with his quiet signals and generous heart, understood immediately. She paused, then turned back to Sarah, a new kind of hope dawning in her eyes. Sarah, still wrapped in her misery, didn't notice the silent exchange. She was too lost in the overwhelming weight of her problems. A fresh wave of tears welled up, and she bit her lip hard to keep from making any more noise. Quiet sobs were already too loud in the sudden, tense silence of the diner, which had fallen under the spell of her distress. Every eye, it seemed, was now on her, a million unseen judgments, or so it felt to her. But one pair of eyes behind the unsunglassed face of a legendary man held only profound pity and an unwavering determination to make things right. He was about to move. The silence in Ruby's diner stretched thick and heavy, broken only by Sarah's muffled sobs. It was the kind of silence that makes everyone uncomfortable, where people shift in their seats, avoid eye contact. and pretend to be deeply interested in their sugar packets. But from his corner, booth, Elvis didn't shift. His gaze remained fixed on Sarah, a steady, compassionate anchor in the sea of awkwardness. He knew this was the moment. He couldn't wait any longer. His half-eaten pancakes sat cold on his plate, forgotten. His milk glass was untouched. His heart was aching for this woman, for her palpable pain. He didn't want to make a big show of it, but he also realized that a truly discreet intervention was likely impossible now. Given the intensity of her distress and the attention it had already drawn, he pushed himself up from the booth. It was a slow, deliberate movement designed not to draw immediate, jarring attention, but it was enough. A few heads, already turned towards Sarah, swiveled slightly towards him. A murmur, just a ripple, started to move through the diner, like wind through tall grass. "Is that him?" "It is." "Oh, my lord." Elvis ignored it. His focus was solely on Sarah. He walked towards her table, his gait unhurried, almost thoughtful. Every step felt charged with purpose. Shirley, seeing him approach, straightened up, a mixture of surprise and profound relief on her face. She stepped back from Sarah's booth, clearing the path, her eyes wide as she watched the king of rock and roll walk directly towards a crying customer. Sarah, still hunched over her face, hidden, felt a shadow fall over her. She heard footsteps, not Shirley's, but heavier, more purposeful. She flinched, bracing herself for whatever indignity was coming next. Maybe the manager was here to tell her to leave, to publicly humiliate her for not being able to pay. "Excuse me, ma'am." A voice rumbled, softly, deep and resonant, yet incredibly gentle. It was a voice that commanded attention, but right now it was used with an almost tender quietness. "Mind if I have a word?" Sarah slowly lifted her head, her eyes red and blurry from tears. Her vision slowly cleared, and she saw him, the man. He was standing beside her table, hat now in his hand, sunglasses gone, revealing those famous, piercing blue eyes. Her breath hitched, not from fear, but from sheer, utter disbelief. It was him, Elvis Presley, standing right next to her. Her heart leaped into her throat. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. She tried to speak, but only a choked gasp escaped. She was mortified. The most famous man in the world was witnessing her at her lowest, most pathetic moment. I'm so sorry," she stammered, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling an overwhelming surge of embarrassment. I didn't mean to cause a scene." Elvis offered her a faint, reassuring smile. "No need to apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice still low. Almost a whisper meant only for her ears, and Shirley's, who stood nearby, her hand over her mouth. "Trouble finds us all sooner or later. Sometimes it just picks a bad time to show its face." He gestured subtly towards the bill lying on the table. "I couldn't help but notice," he continued, his tone devoid of judgment, only concern. "You seem to be having a bit of a predicament with this here check." Sarah looked down at the bill, then back up at him, her face a mask of shame. She wanted to say no, to insist she was fine, that she could handle it, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was stark and undeniable. It's more than I have," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, thick with tears that threatened to start anew. "There was an old charge. I thought I'd paid it." Elvis nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. A deep understanding in his eyes. He didn't patronize her, didn't make her feel small. He just listened. "Life has a way of throwing unexpected curveballs, doesn't it?" he said, his voice still soft. "Sometimes a small one can knock you completely off balance." He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to gently tap the corner of the bill. His touch was light, respectful. "Mind if I take a look at that for a moment?" he asked, his voice still that comforting rumble. It wasn't a demand, but a quiet request, offered with such genuine kindness that Sarah found herself, against her better judgment, simply nodding, too stunned to do anything else. The whole diner held its breath, watching the king, not on a stage, but in a simple diner, about to perform a different kind of miracle. The silence in the diner was now absolute. a hushed anticipation that crackled in the air. Every eye, every single gaze was fixed on Elvis, then on Sarah, then back to Elvis. Even the cooks in the back seemed to have stopped their sizzling and clanking, peering out from the kitchen doors. Sarah felt like she was trapped in a spotlight, her every move, her every tear amplified for an audience she never asked for. Yet the presence of Elvis Presley, so close, so real, was somehow both terrifying and strangely calming. His voice was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her humiliation. Picked up the bill from the table, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. She flinched, not from his touch, but from the jolt of surrealism. This was Elvis. He held the small slip of paper, his eyes scanning the numbers, his brow furrowing slightly, not in anger or judgment, but in contemplation. The extra charge for the coffee and pie, the breakfast she'd just eaten, it all added up to a sum that, to him, was probably trivial. But to her it was a mountain she couldn't climb. He mused, a low sound in his throat. Seems like a simple mix-up, honey. Happens to the best of us. He didn't make a big deal of the amount, didn't scoff or dismiss it. He simply acknowledged it, making it seem less like a personal failing and more like a common occurrence. Sarah, still reeling, tried to regain some composure. I can try to go to the bank later, she stammered, even though she knew her account was practically empty. Or maybe I can wash dishes for it. I'm a hard worker, sir. I really am. The words tumbled out, desperate and raw, reflecting her ingrained need to earn her way, to not be seen as a charity case. Elvis looked up from the bill, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in them, only a profound understanding. Now, hold on a minute, sweetie, he said, his voice still incredibly gentle, barely above a whisper, keeping their conversation as private as possible in a public space. No need for all that. This isn't about washing dishes, this is about a little bit of bad luck hitting a good person. He paused, then reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket. He pulled out a thick leather wallet. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt monumental. The collective breath of the diners seemed to catch suspended in the air. Shirley, standing a few feet away, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears already welling in her own eyes. Sometimes, Elvis continued, his voice a quiet philosophy, we all need a hand. It ain't charity when you're just helping someone get back on their feet. Think of it as a little bit of goodwill. My mama always taught me that a kind gesture. He pulled out a handful of crisp bills, far more than the amount on the check. Sarah's eyes widened, her jaw slack. She tried to protest. No, Mr. Presley, I couldn't possibly. It's too much. Just the bill, please. He silenced her with a gentle, reassuring shake of his head. Honey, please, don't you worry about the amount. This ain't just for your breakfast. Consider this a little something to help you get over this hump. Place the money on the table, carefully placing the diner's bill on top of it, making it clear he was covering it. Then, with another smooth, almost practiced movement, he picked up the remaining bills, folded them, and gently pushed them directly into Sarah's trembling hand. This here, he said, his voice dropping to an even more intimate tone, is for whatever else life might throw at you today. Groceries, a little gas for the car, a small peace of mind, no strings attached, just a fellow traveler offering a bit of help on the road. His words were more than just a financial offering. They were an affirmation. They were validation of her struggle, a recognition that she wasn't alone, and that her worth wasn't tied to her ability to pay a diner bill. He made it seem not like charity, but like a shared human experience. Sarah looked down at the money in her hand, then back up at him. Tears, fresh ones, streamed down her face. But these were different. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of disbelief, of a hope she hadn't felt in months. She couldn't speak, her throat too tight with emotion. He offered her another small, genuine smile, that famous Elvis smile that could melt hearts and soothe souls. Just remember, honey, he said, his voice echoing with profound sincerity. You're strong. You'll get through this, we all do, with a little help from our friends, sometimes even friends we ain't met yet. And in that moment, as the king of rock and roll stood in Ruby's diner, extending not just money but genuine human kindness and compassion to a stranger, the first few people in the diner, witnessing this incredible, unexpected display, began to openly. The silence in Ruby's diner shattered. Not with noise, but with the collective gasp of 100 witnessing souls. What followed was a wave of emotion, raw and undeniable, that swept through the entire room. It started with a sniffle, then a few soft sobs, quickly escalating into an open, unrestrained outpouring of tears. Men and women, young and old, found themselves wiping their eyes, choked up by the sheer, unadulterated beauty of the moment. Sarah, still clutching the money in her trembling hand, was a mess of tears. These weren't tears of shame or despair anymore, but tears of profound gratitude and overwhelming shock. She looked at the money, then at Elvis, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of what was happening. This wasn't a dream. This was real. "Mr. Presley," she finally managed to stammer, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Oh, thank you." She tried to reach out, perhaps to shake his hand, but her own hands were shaking too much. Elvis, ever graceful, took her hand gently in his grip firm and warm. "No need for all those fancy words, honey," he said, his voice still low, but now with a comforting resonance that carried just a little further, enough for those closest to hear. "Sometimes the best thanks is just passing it on when you're able. A little bit of kindness goes a long way in this world, doesn't it?" He glanced around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the tear-streaked faces of the patrons. He didn't grandstand, didn't milk the moment for applause, but his presence, his sheer aura of charisma and genuine warmth was undeniable. He understood the power of a gesture, the impact it could have. "We all face our own battles," he continued, his voice now a little stronger, Cradians to hear. "And sometimes those battles leave us feeling alone. But we ain't alone, not truly. We're all in this together, folks. A little understanding, a little compassion. That's what makes us human." His words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply. They were not just about the money he'd given, but about the spirit behind it. They were about looking out for your neighbor, about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing the shared struggles of humanity, and coming from him, from the king. It felt like a sermon delivered from a velvet-clad stage, yet somehow more intimate, more powerful in the humble setting of Ruby's diner. Surely, her own cheeks wet with tears, finally let out a choked sob. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He's right, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's absolutely right." A few people in the diner began to clap, a hesitant, scattered applause that quickly grew, swelling into a wave of appreciation. Others simply sat in stunned, emotional silence, allowing the tears to flow freely. A burly construction worker, his face streaked with dirt and tears, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and blew his nose loudly. An elderly woman at a nearby table openly wept into her coffee cup. Parents hugged their children tighter, whispering about the importance of being kind. Elvis held Sarah's gaze for another moment, his thumb gently caressing the back of her hand, a gesture of deep, unspoken comfort. "You hold your head up, Sarah," he said, his voice unwavering. "You got a good heart. And that's worth more than all the money in the world. Things'll turn around, I promise you." He slowly released her hand, leaving her with the crisp bills and the indelible imprint of his touch. He then turned to Shirley, giving her a conspiratorial wink. "And you, Shirley," he said, his voice lightening slightly, "you keep making those pancakes, and maybe a little extra for good measure on me, for anyone who needs it." He nodded towards the open diner. Shirley could only nod, tears streaming down her face, a wide, wobbly smile breaking through. "Oh, Mr. Presley," she choked out, "you got a heart as big as Texas." Elvis offered a final heartwarming smile, a flash of pure, unadulterated charm that somehow managed to be both humble and majestic. He didn't linger, didn't milk the moment. He had delivered his message, had offered his kindness, and now it was time to let the ripples spread. He simply turned, and with the same quiet grace with which he had approached, he began to walk back to his booth, leaving behind a diner full of people, unified in their tears, their hearts overflowing with a renewed sense of hope and the profound power of human connection. King had not just paid a bill, he had paid tribute to the very best of humanity. As Elvis walked back to his booth, the sound of applause grew louder. A spontaneous, heartfelt tribute from a diner full of people whose hearts had been cracked open. It wasn't the roaring, adoring applause he was used to hearing in packed concert halls, but something far more intimate, more genuine. It was the sound of gratitude, of surprise, of a shared emotional release. People weren't just clapping for a celebrity. They were clapping for a compassionate human being. Sarah watched him go, a dazed, tearful smile on her face. Her hand was still clenched around the money he had given her, the crisp bills feeling unreal, almost sacred. It wasn't just a financial relief. It was the sheer humanity of the act. He hadn't just thrown money at her. He had seen her, truly, seen her in her moment of utter despair, and offered solace along with the cash. He had spoken to her with respect and understanding, validated her struggle, and given her hope. "Sarah, honey," Shirley whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "Are you all right? Can you believe it just happened?" Sarah could only nod, tears still streaming down her face, a mixture of joy and disbelief. I can't believe it," she choked out. He was so kind." Across the diner, conversations erupted, no longer polite murmurs but animated emotional exchanges. Strangers turned to each other, their faces wet with tears, sharing their astonishment and admiration. "Did you see that?" an older woman exclaimed to her husband, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "He didn't have to do that, not one bit." "That's the kind of man he is," her husband replied, his own voice gruff with emotion. "Generous to a fault. Always heard the stories, but to see it." A young waitress new to Ruby's was openly weeping by the coffee machine. "I've never seen anything like it," she sniffled to Shirley. "He didn't even know her." Shirley just smiled, a radiant, tearful smile. "That's why he's the king, honey. Not just of music of hearts." Elvis, back at his booth, picked up his coffee cup as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Took a sip, his gaze still sweeping over the diner, taking in the scene. He saw the raw emotion, the lingering tears, the quiet conversations, the shared sense of awe. He felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was why he did it. This was why he sometimes broke his own rules about anonymity, to remind people that kindness still existed, that there was still good in the world, even in the smallest, most unexpected places. He caught Shirley's eye again, and she gave him a watery thumbs up. He returned it with a genuine, humble smile. Sarah, meanwhile, was slowly processing the enormity of the moment. The weight she had carried for so long, the crushing anxiety of financial insecurity, had suddenly, miraculously, lifted. It wasn't just the bill paid. It was the few extra dollars that meant she could buy some groceries, put gas in her car, maybe even get that light bulb fixed in her apartment. But more than that, it was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of being worthy of such an extraordinary act of kindness. She stood up, still a little shaky, but with a newfound strength in her posture. She looked around the diner at the faces still turned towards her, no longer with pity or curiosity, but with shared emotion and quiet respect. She managed a small, brave smile. Then almost instinctively she walked over to Elvis's booth. He looked up, a question in his eyes. "Mr. Presley," she said, her voice still trembling but firm. I just wanted to say thank you again from the bottom of my heart. You don't know what this means." He put down his coffee cup. "Sarah," he said, using her name, making it personal. "I do know what it means. I really do. And you don't owe me a thing. Just promise me you'll keep that head up, all right?" She nodded, tears welling up again. But these were happy tears. "I promise," He reached out a hand, extending it towards her. "Shake on it, then." Sarah took his hand, her small calloused fingers enveloped in his strong, famous grasp. It was a simple handshake, but it felt like a covenant, a bond forged in a moment of shared humanity. The diner watched, captivated, as the woman whose despair had moved. The king stood tall, her spirit clearly, powerfully uplifted. It was a scene that would live in the diner's history, etched into the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Elvis held Sarah's hand for a moment longer, a silent exchange passing between them, one of understanding, of shared empathy, of a promise of resilience. He wasn't just a celebrity anymore. He was a human being who had offered a lifeline, and she was a human being who had received it with open gratitude. The warmth of his hand was like a tangible comfort, something solid in a world that had felt so unstable just moments before. "You got a good spirit, Sarah," he said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand before he released it. "Don't ever forget that. Hard times don't last, but tough people do." Sarah could only nod, tears still flowing freely down her face, but her eyes shining with a light that hadn't been there before. She felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just a financial relief. It was the feeling of being seen, of being acknowledged, of not being invisible in her struggle. He then reached over, picked up a pen from his jacket pocket, and pulled a small, pristine napkin from the dispenser. "Here," he said, offering her a genuine, heartwarming smile. "Something to remember this morning by in case you ever need a little reminder that there's always hope." He quickly scrawled his famous signature across the napkin. "Elvis Presley." He wrote his handwriting as distinctive as his voice. He handed it to her. Sarah took the napkin, her fingers tracing the familiar loops of his name. An autograph. It felt like a dream. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still thick with emotion. This wasn't just a souvenir, it was a tangible symbol of a turning point, a reminder that kindness existed, that miracles could happen in the most ordinary of places. Shirley, who had been watching with tears in her eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Presley?" she began, her voice quivering. "I don't know what to say. You've done something truly special here." Elvis stood up from his booth, stretching slightly. He gave Shirley a warm, appreciative look. "Just doing what feels right, Shirley," he said, his voice now a little more relaxed, the initial tension of the public act having dissipated. "You run a good diner here, good food, good people, and you," he added, turning to Sarah again, "you keep being that good person, all right?" He looked around the diner one last time, a gentle, almost benevolent gaze sweeping over the still, emotional crowd. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod to a few of the patrons who caught his eye, a silent acknowledgement of their shared human moment. The applause had died down, replaced by a reverent hush, as if everyone was afraid to break the spell. He then turned back to Sarah, his expression softening further. "What do you do, Sarah?" he asked, a genuine curiosity in his tone, extending the interaction beyond the single transaction. "I work at the laundromat down the street," she replied, surprised by his question but answering honestly. It's honest work." "Good for you," Elvis said, a sincere admiration in his voice. "Honest work is important. Work. Keep at it. You got grit. I can see that." He gave her a final, reassuring smile. A smile that conveyed not just kindness, but a deep respect for her struggle and her determination. He then turned, picked up his hat, and with a final, almost imperceptible nod to Shirley, he began to walk towards the exit. He didn't rush, didn't sneak out. He simply walked a figure of quiet dignity and immense presence, leaving behind a profoundly changed atmosphere in Ruby's diner. The air, once heavy with the weight of Sarah's despair, now hummed with a different kind of energy, one of shared emotion, of awe, and of a renewed belief in the power of human connection. The door swung shut behind him, the small bell above it jingling softly, a final, gentle chime, marking his departure. For a few moments no one moved, no one spoke. They were all still processing the miracle they had just witnessed. Sarah stood there, the money in her hand, the autograph clutched close, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. But these were tears of profound, overwhelming hope. King had not just paid a bill. He had paid a visit to her soul, and in doing so had touched every single person in the room. The lingering silence in Ruby's diner after Elvis's departure was unlike any silence before it. It wasn't awkward or tense. It was filled with a palpable sense of awe. A quiet hum of shared emotion. Slowly, conversations began to bubble up again, but they were different now. Whispers of astonishment, murmurs of admiration choked up retellings of what had just happened. "Can you believe it?" a man at the counter said to the cook, his voice hoarse. "Elvis Presley, right here in Ruby's. And what he did for that poor girl. Saw it with my own eyes," the cook replied, shaking his head in disbelief, a wide emotional grin on his face. "Never seen anything like it. Never." Sarah, still rooted to the spot where Elvis had left her, finally felt her legs give way, and she sank back into her booth, the money and the signed napkin clutched to her chest. She looked down at the bills, then at the familiar signature. It was real, all of it. The weight of her immediate financial woes had lifted, but more importantly, a much heavier burden had been removed from her spirit. The crushing sense of being alone, of being invisible in her struggles, had been replaced by an overwhelming feeling of being seen, of being cared for by the most unlikely of saviors. Shirley rushed over, pulling up a chair beside Sarah. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling? Are you all right?" Sarah looked at Shirley, her eyes still brimming. I don't know," she whispered, a small, tearful laugh escaping her. "I feel like I can breathe again, like someone finally saw me." She held up the napkin. "He gave me this." Shirley took the napkin gently, her eyes widening as she read the signature. "Oh, Sarah," she murmured, "this is something you'll cherish forever. He's a true angel, that man." For the next hour, Sarah was the quiet center of attention, not in an intrusive way, but in a respectful, sympathetic one. Other patrons approached her table, not to gawk, but to offer words of comfort and solidarity. A woman offered her a tissue, a man nodded kindly. People shared their own stories of hardship or of unexpected kindness received. The diner, usually a place of individual breakfast, had become a community, bound by a shared, profound emotional experience. "Called me strong," Sarah told Shirley, her voice still full of wonder. "He said I had grit. He didn't even know me, but he saw something in me. He saw the truth. Honey, you are strong. You always have been." Meanwhile, Elvis was driving away from Ruby's diner, the familiar hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to his thought. Pulled off his hat and sunglasses, letting the morning sun warm his face. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of rightness in his soul. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the connection, the brief, powerful moment where fame dissolved and only humanity remained. He thought about Sarah, her tear-streaked face, the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He thought about the shame he'd seen there, the kind he knew so well from his own youth. He remembered the feeling of being judged, of feeling less than simply because of circumstance, and he was glad, deeply glad, that he could alleviate that even for a moment. "Well, Lord," he murmured to himself, a slight smile playing on his lips. That felt good. Real good. He knew. The stories would spread. They always did. His generosity was legendary, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes dismissed as a publicity stunt. But in that diner for those people, it was real. It was true. It was a genuine act of compassion that resonated deep within the human spirit. He thought about his Mama Gladys, her face etched with worry, but always full of love. She would have approved. She would have been proud. She had always taught him the importance of giving back, of remembering where you came from, no matter how high you climbed. And in that ordinary diner, on that ordinary Tuesday morning, Elvis Presley had honored her memory, not just with his money, but with his heart. He felt lighter, refreshed, as if a small burden had been lifted from his own shoulders. The day felt brighter. The world for a moment seemed a kinder place. A week later, Ruby's Diner hummed with its usual morning rhythm. But there was a subtle difference in the air. Clatter of plates felt a little lighter. The conversations a little warmer. A framed enlarged photograph, hastily printed and hung behind the counter, showed a blurry but unmistakable image of Elvis Presley, his hand gently extended towards a tearful Sarah, caught in that incredible moment of kindness. Below it, a small, handwritten sign simply read, "Kindness is king." Sarah walked into the diner not with the usual weight on her shoulders, but with a lightness in her step. The money Elvis had given her had been a lifeline. It had covered the lingering bill, allowed her to buy a week's worth of proper groceries, fresh vegetables, milk, bread. Things she'd gone without for too long. She'd even managed to put a little extra aside, a small nest egg that made her feel a surprising sense of security. Car was still sputtering, but the immediate crisis had passed, and the peace of mind was priceless. More importantly, her spirit had been profoundly lifted. The shame she'd felt had vanished, replaced by a quiet dignity. "I feel like one, Shirley, I really do." She glanced at the photo behind the counter. "It still feels like a dream sometimes." "It was real, honey," Shirley said, her voice soft. "And everyone in this diner remembers it. It's become a legend." Indeed, the story of Elvis's kindness had spread like wildfire through the local community. People who hadn't been in Ruby's in years were stopping by, not just for the pancakes, but to see the spot, to feel the lingering warmth of that extraordinary morning. The diner had become a small monument to unexpected grace, a testament to the idea that even the most famous among us could connect on a deeply human level. Sarah ordered a simple coffee today. Savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands, she thought about Elvis's words about passing it on. She knew she didn't have much, but she had a renewed sense of purpose. She had started volunteering a few evenings a week at a local soup kitchen, helping others who were struggling. It was a small act, but it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of paying forward the kindness she had received. She kept the signed napkin tucked safely in her wallet, not just as a memento, but as a constant reminder, a reminder of the day her world had shifted, a reminder that empathy could bridge any gap, that a simple act of generosity could restore faith, and that even in the toughest times there was always hope. The morning sun, once again filtering through the diner windows, felt brighter, warmer. The ordinary hum of conversation seemed to carry a sweeter melody. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, a peaceful smile on her face. Her life wasn't magically perfect now, but the crushing weight had lifted. She knew she still had challenges ahead, but she faced them with a resilience she hadn't known. She possessed a resilience that had been rediscovered in the most unexpected of places, thanks to the kindness of a king who had seen her tears and had chosen simply to care. And as she looked out at the bustling diner, a sense of profound peace settled over her, knowing that one man's big heart had truly changed her world, and in doing so had quietly, beautifully, brought a whole diner to tears.